Margaret Chun sat by her small kitchen window, watching the morning sun cast long shadows across the empty street. At 78, her days had settled into a quiet rhythm that most people would find lonely. But Margaret had learned to find comfort in the silence. She lived alone in apartment 4B of the old Riverside complex, a building that had seen better days but still held on to its dignity, much like herself. The apartment wasn't much to look at. The wallpaper was faded, showing tiny roses that had once been bright pink but now looked more like pale ghosts. The furniture was old but well kept, each piece carrying memories of a life fully lived. Her late husband Robert had picked out that brown leather chair in the corner. It still smelled faintly of his aftershave, even though he'd been gone for 3 years now, but the real heart of Margaret's small home was the upright piano that stood against the far wall. It wasn't fancy or expensive. The wood was scratched, and some of the keys stuck if you didn't press them just right. This piano had belonged to her mother, and before that her grandmother. 3 generations of women had run their fingers across these same keys, pouring their hearts into music when words weren't enough. Every morning, after her cup of tea and toast, Margaret would sit on the worn piano bench and play. Her fingers, though wrinkled and sometimes stiff from arthritis, still remembered every song she'd ever learned. She'd start with something gentle, maybe a simple melody from her childhood. Then she'd move on to more complex pieces, the ones that made her feel alive again. The music filled her small apartment and drifted through the thin walls. Margaret didn't know that Mrs. Peterson next door actually enjoyed listening to her play while she did her morning dishes. She also didn't know that old Mr. Williams downstairs sometimes turned off his television just to hear her music better. But she did know about Karen. Karen lived in 4A, right next to Margaret. She was one of those people who seemed to find fault with everything and everyone around her. At 45, Karen worked as a manager at a local store and took pride in telling people what they were doing wrong. She had moved into the building 2 years ago and immediately started complaining about everything from the hallway lighting to the mailbox arrangements. Margaret's piano playing had become Karen's biggest complaint. Every few weeks, Karen would knock on Margaret's door with a sour expression and a list of grievances. "That racket is disturbing my peace," she'd say, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. "Some of us have jobs and need quiet time to relax." Margaret always apologized politely, even though she only played during daytime hours and never late at night. She'd explain that music was important to her, that it helped her feel connected to her family's memory. But Karen never seemed to care about Margaret's explanations. To her, the elderly woman was just an annoyance, someone who didn't matter enough to deserve consideration. What Karen didn't know, what nobody in the building knew, was that Margaret Chun had once been someone remarkable. 50 years ago, she had been Margaret Liu, a rising star in the classical music world. She'd won competitions, performed in beautiful concert halls, and had even been accepted into a prestigious music conservatory on a full scholarship, but life had other plans for Margaret. Her parents had fallen ill when she was just 22, right when her career was beginning to take off. Being the only child, she'd made the difficult choice to give up her dreams and care for them. She'd married Robert, a kind man who understood her sacrifice, and together they'd built a quiet, loving life focused on family rather than fame. Margaret had taught piano lessons for many years to help support their household. She'd watched hundreds of students learn to love music, sharing her passion even though she could no longer pursue it professionally. Some of her students had gone on to have successful musical careers, and Margaret felt proud knowing she'd played a small part in their success. After her parents passed away, and later when Robert became sick, Margaret had put away any thoughts of returning to her musical ambitions. She'd become a caregiver, a teacher, a wife, and eventually a widow. Music remained her private joy, something she shared only with the walls of her apartment and the neighbors who happened to listen. Now, in her golden years, Margaret's fingers still moved across the piano keys with muscle memory that decades couldn't erase. She could play Chopin as if she'd performed it yesterday. Her interpretation of classical pieces remained sophisticated and deeply emotional. But in her small apartment, wearing simple clothes and living on a modest pension, she looked like any other elderly woman trying to pass the time. The contrast between Margaret's appearance and her abilities was striking. Her gray hair was always neatly pinned back, and she preferred comfortable cardigans and sensible shoes. She shopped carefully with coupons, walked slowly due to a slight limp from an old injury, and spoke quietly when she occasionally chatted with neighbors in the hallway. Nothing about her suggested that she possessed extraordinary talent. This disconnect between appearance and reality was exactly what made Margaret an easy target for someone like Karen. Karen saw only what was on the surface, an old woman with an old piano making noise in a rundown apartment building. She couldn't imagine that this quiet neighbor might have once commanded the attention of sophisticated audiences or moved people to tears with her performances. Margaret's daily routine was simple but meaningful to her. After breakfast and piano practice, she'd take a short walk around the neighborhood if the weather was nice. She'd stop by the small grocery store where the cashiers knew her by name and always asked about her day. Sometimes she'd sit in the park and watch children play, remembering when she used to bring her own children there years ago. In the afternoons, she'd often call her daughter Linda, who lived across the country with her own family. Linda worried about her mother living alone but respected Margaret's independence. They'd talk about grandchildren, the weather, and daily life, but Margaret rarely mentioned her music. It seemed like such a small part of her world now, even though it remained the thing that brought her the most joy. Evenings were for reading, watching a little television, and sometimes playing piano again if she felt like it. Margaret went to bed early and woke up early, living by the natural rhythms that seemed to suit her age and circumstances. It was a peaceful life, even if it was sometimes lonely, but peace can be fragile, especially when it depends on the kindness of others. Margaret's quiet contentment was about to be challenged by someone who saw her as nothing more than an easy target for cruel entertainment. She had no idea that her simple life was about to change dramatically, or that the piano skills she'd kept hidden away were about to become the center of a storm. She never could have imagined, as Margaret settled into her evening routine that particular day, playing a soft lullaby she remembered from her childhood. She couldn't have guessed that Karen was next door, plotting something that would turn her peaceful world upside down. The music that had always been Margaret's private sanctuary was about to become very public indeed. Karen's plan started with a late-night television binge that she'd regret for the rest of her life, though she didn't know it yet. She was flipping through channels, annoyed after another long day at work, when she stumbled across a show called Hidden Talents. The host, a slick-looking man named Derek Mills, was laughing with his audience about some poor person who'd just embarrassed themselves on stage. "And remember, folks," Derek was saying with that fake smile of his, "we're always looking for more hidden talents to showcase. Know someone who thinks they're special but probably isn't? Send us their story. We love giving ordinary people their moment in the spotlight." Karen sat up straighter on her couch. The wheels in her mind started turning as she thought about Margaret and that constant piano playing next door. A wicked smile spread across her face as she grabbed her phone and started typing. The next morning, Karen was practically buzzing with excitement as she sent her submission to the show. She painted Margaret as a delusional old woman who believed she was some kind of piano virtuoso but was really just making noise. "She plays this old broken piano all day long," Karen wrote, "and I think she actually believes she's good at it. It would be hilarious to put her on your show and let everyone see how ridiculous she really is." What Karen didn't mention was that Margaret's playing was actually beautiful. She didn't tell them about the time she'd secretly listened at the wall, impressed despite herself by the complex melodies floating through from next door. Karen's jealousy and mean spirit clouded her judgment. She saw only an opportunity to humiliate someone she viewed as beneath her. 3 days later, Karen got a call that made her day. A cheerful production assistant named Amy called to tell her that the show was very interested in Margaret's story. "We think she'd be perfect for our segment," Amy said. "Can you help us get in touch with her?" Karen practically giggled with glee. She volunteered to approach Margaret herself, promising to make it sound like a wonderful opportunity. The show's team loved having someone on the inside who could deliver their target without suspicion. That afternoon, Karen knocked on Margaret's door with a completely different attitude than usual. Instead of her typical scowl, she wore a bright, fake smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, Margaret, hi there," Karen said sweetly when the older woman opened the door. "I hope I'm not bothering you." Margaret was surprised by Karen's sudden friendliness. "Not at all, dear. Is everything all right?" "Actually, I have some exciting news for you," Karen continued, practically bouncing on her toes. "You know how talented you are with that piano of yours? Well, I happened to mention you to some people I know in television, and they're very interested in having you on a show." Margaret's eyes widened with confusion and a little fear. "A television show? Oh my, I don't think I'm the type for that sort of thing." "But you are," Karen insisted, laying it on thick. "It's called Hidden Talents, and they showcase people with amazing abilities that the world hasn't discovered yet. They think you'd be perfect." What Karen told Margaret next was a carefully crafted lie designed to get her to agree. She described the show as a respectful platform for ordinary people to share their gifts. She painted pictures of appreciative audiences and supportive hosts who celebrated everyone who appeared on the show. "They really want to honor people like you," Karen said, putting her hand on Margaret's arm. "People who have beautiful talents but have never had the chance to share them with the world. Isn't that exactly what you deserve?" Margaret felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced in years. Could it be possible that her music meant something to people beyond these apartment walls? The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. "I don't know," Margaret said hesitantly. "I'm not sure I'm good enough for television. I just play for my own enjoyment." "That's exactly what makes you special," Karen replied, amazed at how easily the lies came. "You're not trying to show off or be something you're not. You're just genuine, and that's what people want to see." Meanwhile, the producers at Hidden Talents were having a very different conversation about Margaret. Derek Mills was reviewing Karen's submission with his team, and they were all excited about the entertainment value. "This is perfect," Derek said, leaning back in his expensive chair. "An old lady who thinks she can play piano. The audience will eat this up. We can play up the whole chasing her dreams angle and then watch it all fall apart." His head writer, a cynical man named Tony, was already crafting jokes. "We can do the whole thing about senior moments, maybe make some cracks about her needing glasses to see the keys. The audience loves when we roast these delusional types." The production team started planning what they thought would be an easy target. They assumed Margaret would be a typical amateur who overestimated her abilities. None of them bothered to do any real research into her background. If they had, they might have discovered her real history and realized they were making a terrible mistake. Back at the apartment building, Margaret spent the next few days thinking about Karen's offer. She called her daughter Linda to discuss it, though she felt a bit embarrassed bringing it up. "A television show, Mom?" Linda said, sounding concerned. "Are you sure this is legitimate?" "There are a lot of shows that take advantage of people." Karen seemed very sincere, Margaret replied, though she had her own doubts. She said they want to celebrate people like me, people who have talents but never got to share them. Linda wasn't convinced, but she could hear the hope in her mother's voice. It had been so long since Margaret had sounded excited about anything. "Just be careful, Mom. Make sure you understand what you're getting into." After several conversations with the show's producers, who continued to lie about their intentions, Margaret finally agreed to appear. They told her it would be a wonderful experience, that the audience would appreciate her music, and that she'd be treated with respect and dignity. Every word was calculated to manipulate her into saying yes. The producers sent Margaret information about the taping date and what to expect. They told her to dress nicely and bring any sheet music she might want to use. They promised her a beautiful piano and a supportive audience. What they didn't tell her was that they were planning to sabotage her performance and set her up for public humiliation. Karen watched all of this unfold with growing excitement. She imagined Margaret making a fool of herself on national television, finally getting what Karen thought she deserved for all that noise she made with her piano. Karen had no idea that she was about to become part of something much bigger than her petty neighborhood grudge as the date approached. Margaret felt a mixture of excitement and terror. She practiced extra hours on her old piano, choosing pieces. That meant something special to her. She pressed her best dress and even bought new shoes for the occasion. In her heart, she hoped this might be a chance to honor her mother's memory and share the music that had sustained her through so many difficult years. Neither Margaret nor Karen had any idea that they were about to become part of a story that would change both their lives forever, though in very different ways. The morning of the television taping, Margaret woke up before her alarm clock rang. Her stomach was doing little flips, and her hands felt shaky as she made her morning tea. She'd barely slept the night before going over her chosen pieces in her mind again and again. She'd decided to play Chopin's Minute Waltz, a piece her mother had taught her when she was just 12 years old. If she had time, maybe she'd follow it with something gentler. Perhaps Debussy's Clair de Lune. Margaret stood in front of her small bathroom mirror, carefully applying the lipstick she'd bought specially for this occasion. It was a soft pink, color that reminded her of the roses in her faded wallpaper. She'd chosen her navy blue dress, the one she'd worn to her grandson's wedding 2 years ago. It was the nicest thing she owned, and she'd pressed it carefully the night before Dot as she pinned her gray hair into a neat bun. Margaret caught sight of her reflection and felt a moment of doubt. She looked like exactly what she was an elderly woman getting, ready for what might be the biggest moment she'd had in decades. "You can do this," she whispered to herself. The same words her mother used to say before piano recitals long ago. The taxi arrived right on time. Margaret had never taken a taxi to anywhere this important before, and she sat in the back seat clutching her small purse, watching the familiar streets of her neighborhood disappear behind her. The driver, a friendly man named Pete, tried to make conversation. "So you're going to be on TV today?" he asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "That's pretty exciting. What's the show about?" "It's called Hidden Talents," Margaret replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "They want me to play piano." "Well, that sounds wonderful," Pete said with genuine warmth. "I bet you'll do great." Margaret smiled at his kindness, not knowing that in a few hours she'd need to remember that there were still good people in the world who meant what they said. The television studio was bigger and more intimidating than Margaret had imagined. The building was all glass and steel, with people rushing around looking important and busy. Margaret felt very small as she walked through the lobby, her low heels clicking softly on the polished marble floor. A young production assistant named Jennifer met her at the reception desk. Jennifer had been working on the show for 6 months, and she'd learned not to get too attached to the guests. Most of them were brought on to be laughed at, and Jennifer had started to feel uncomfortable with her job. But she needed the money, so she'd learned to just do what she was told and try not to think about it too much. Double quotes, "Mrs. Chun," Jennifer said with a professional smile. "Welcome to Hidden Talents. I'm here to help you get ready for your big moment." Margaret followed Jennifer through a maze of hallways lined with posters of the show's previous episodes. Some showed people laughing and clapping, others showed confused-looking guests standing awkwardly on stage. Margaret tried not to look too closely at those ones. The green room where Margaret waited was small and cramped, with mismatched furniture and harsh fluorescent lighting. There was a coffee machine in the corner and a plate of stale donuts on a wobbly table. Margaret sat on the edge of a worn couch, her hands folded in her lap, trying to calm her nerves through the thin walls. She could hear voices from the production office next door. She couldn't make out all the words, but she caught enough to make her stomach sink. Someone was talking about the old piano lady and laughing about how this is going to be hilarious. Another voice mentioned something about the piano being perfectly broken. For the segment, Margaret's heart started beating faster. Were they talking about her? Surely not. Karen had said this was a show that celebrated people's talents. Maybe they were discussing someone else, some other guest who was having problems, but deep down, Margaret's instincts were telling her something was wrong. She'd lived long enough to recognize the tone of people who were planning something cruel. It was the same tone the mean girls had used in high school when they were plotting to embarrass someone. It was the sound of people who found joy in others' pain. Jennifer came back to check on her, carrying a clipboard and looking stressed. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Chun? Ready for your moment in the spotlight?" "I'm a bit nervous," Margaret admitted. "I couldn't help but overhear some conversation from next door. They seemed to be talking about a piano that was broken." Jennifer's face went pale for just a moment before she forced another smile. "Oh, don't worry about that. Sometimes the equipment has little issues, but our technicians are great at fixing things. You'll have everything you need out there." It was a lie, and Jennifer hated herself for telling it. She knew exactly what was planned for Margaret. The piano on stage had been deliberately sabotaged. Several keys had been made to stick, the bench was set at the wrong height, and there was even a small piece of paper wedged inside to create a buzzing sound. The whole thing was designed to make Margaret's performance as difficult and embarrassing as possible. Meanwhile, in the main studio, Derek Mills was doing his final preparation with his writing team. They were going over the jokes they'd planned, the cruel comments they'd make, and the way they'd build up Margaret's introduction to make her eventual failure even more devastating. "Remember," Derek told his team, "we want the audience primed to laugh from the moment she walks out. I'll do the whole thing about senior citizens and their hobbies. Maybe throw in some jokes about retirement homes having talent shows. By the time she sits down at that broken piano, they'll be ready to roar." Tony, the head writer, was reading through his notes. "I've got some great material about outdated music and how nobody wants to hear songs from the Stone Age. And when she starts hitting those stuck keys, I've got a whole bit about maybe she should try the kazoo instead." The crew members setting up the cameras and lighting equipment tried not to listen to these conversations. Most of them had families, some had elderly parents or grandparents of their own. It didn't feel right to be part of something designed to humiliate an old woman who was just trying to share something she loved. But they needed their jobs, and speaking up against Derek Mills was a good way to get fired. The audience was filing into the studio, and the warm-up comedian was already working to get them in the mood to laugh at whatever Derek presented to them. "We've got some real characters coming out today," he told the crowd. "I hope you're ready to see some interesting interpretations of what people call talent." Back in the green room, Margaret was trying to stay calm by running through her pieces mentally. Her fingers moved slightly as she imagined playing the keys, muscle memory guiding her through the familiar melodies. She thought about her mother, who had always told her that music was a gift meant to be shared with love. She thought about Robert, who used to sit and listen to her play in the evenings. His eyes closed and a peaceful smile on his face, a makeup artist came in to touch up Margaret's appearance. The woman was kind, chatting gently about the weather and complimenting Margaret's dress. She applied just a light amount of powder and lipstick, enough to look good under the bright studio lights. "You have such beautiful hands," the makeup artist sighed, noticing Margaret's long, graceful fingers. "Perfect for playing piano." Margaret smiled, feeling a little more confident. Maybe everything would be all right after all. Maybe she was just being paranoid about those voices she'd overheard. But as the time for her appearance grew closer, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into something much different than what she'd been promised. The moment had arrived. Jennifer appeared at the green room door with a nervous smile and a clipboard clutched tightly in her hands. "Mrs. Chun, it's time," she said softly, her voice carrying an apologetic tone that Margaret didn't quite understand. Yet Margaret stood up slowly, smoothing down her navy dress one last time. Her legs felt unsteady, but she took a deep breath and followed Jennifer down a narrow hallway toward the studio. The sounds grew louder as they walked, audience chatter, music, and the unmistakable voice of Derek Mills warming up the crowd with his practiced charm. "Now remember," Jennifer said as they paused outside the studio doors, "just be yourself out there. The audience is going to love you." The words came out flat, like she was reading from a script she didn't believe in. Jennifer had said these same words to dozens of guests, knowing full well that most of them were about to be humiliated for entertainment. Margaret nodded. not noticing Jennifer's discomfort. She was too focused on trying to calm her racing heart and remember the opening notes of her chosen piece. Through the studio doors, she could hear Derek's voice getting louder. "Ladies and gentlemen," Derek was saying to the audience, his tone already dripping with barely concealed mockery, "our next guest is truly special. We have a 78-year-old woman who believes she has what it takes to be a piano virtuoso." Now, I know what you're thinking. We've all heard our fair share of retirement home talent shows, right? The audience chuckled, and Margaret felt her stomach drop. That didn't sound like the respectful introduction she'd been promised. Through the small window in the door, she could see Derek pacing the stage with that artificial smile she'd noticed on television. "Her neighbor contacted us," Derek continued, milking every word for maximum effect, because she was so impressed by the daily concerts happening next door. "Apparently, our guest practices for hours every day on what I'm told is a very vintage piano, and by vintage I mean old enough to have been played by Beethoven himself." More laughter from the audience. Margaret's hands started trembling. This wasn't what Karen had described. This wasn't what the producers had promised her. Derek was making her sound like a joke before she'd even stepped onto the stage. So let's give a warm welcome to Margaret Chun, our aspiring concert pianist. The studio doors opened, and Margaret stepped into a world of bright lights and staring faces. The audience applauded, but she could hear the underlying current of amusement in their clapping. Some people were already smiling in anticipation of what they expected to be an entertaining disaster. Derek Mills walked over to greet her. His arms spread wide in an exaggerated gesture of welcome. He was younger than she'd expected, probably in his 40s, with perfectly styled hair and a suit that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. His smile was wide but cold, like a shark showing its teeth. "Margaret, welcome to Hidden Talents," Derek said loudly enough for the audience to hear every word. "You look absolutely lovely today. Tell me, how long have you been playing piano? Since the Civil War?" The audience laughed, and Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. She hadn't expected such a rude comment right away. "I've been playing since I was 6 years old," she answered quietly, her voice barely carrying over the microphone clip 2. "Derek's shirt, 6 years old? That's amazing," Derek said with fake enthusiasm. "So we're talking about, 72 years of practice. You must be practically perfect by now." His tone made it clear he thought the opposite was true. Margaret tried to smile, but confusion was written all over her face. This wasn't going at all like she'd been told it would. Where was the respect and appreciation she'd been promised? Why was Derek making jokes about her age before he'd even heard her play? "Now, I understand you've brought some classical music for us today," Derek continued, walking her toward the piano. "Nothing too challenging, I hope. We don't want to strain those fingers." As they approached the instrument, Margaret's heart sank even further. The piano looked wrong. It was positioned awkwardly on the stage, and even from a distance, she could see that something was off about the keys. Some of them looked like they were sitting higher than others, and there seemed to be something wedged into the strings. "Here's your instrument, maestro," Derek said with a grand gesture. "I hope it meets your professional standards." Margaret sat down on the piano bench and immediately realized it was set too low for her height. After decades of playing, she knew exactly how she needed to sit to reach the keys comfortably. This bench would force her to strain her arms and shoulders, making it much harder to play well. She looked up at Derek with a polite smile. "Excuse me, could we adjust the bench height just a little? It's not quite right for me." Derek made a show of looking concerned. "Oh, I'm sorry, but we can't make adjustments now. We're live on television and we have a schedule to keep. I'm sure a talented pianist like yourself can adapt, right?" The audience chuckled again, and Margaret realized she was trapped. She could either refuse to play and look difficult, or she could try to make the best of a bad situation. Being the dignified person she was, she chose to adapt. Margaret placed her fingers on the keys, testing them gently. Several of the keys in the middle register stuck when she pressed them, and there was definitely something making a buzzing sound inside the piano. She could feel Derek watching her closely, waiting for her reaction instead of complaining or making excuses. Margaret simply nodded to herself and began to adjust. In her mind, she quickly rearranged her chosen piece to work around the broken keys. She'd dealt with imperfect pianos before, during her years of teaching. She'd played on instruments in church basements and community centers that weren't always in perfect condition. "Whenever you're ready," Derek said, stepping back with his arms crossed. His body language screamed skepticism, and the audience picked up on his attitude. Margaret closed her eyes for just a moment, trying to block out the hostile energy around her. She thought about her mother, who had taught her that music was bigger than any single performance. She thought about all the students she'd inspired over the years, and all the quiet evenings she'd spent playing for Robert. When she opened her eyes, Margaret's hands were steady. She positioned them over the keys, making quick mental notes about which ones to avoid and how to modify her piece to work with the sabotaged instrument. "I'd like to play Chopin's Minute Waltz for you today," she said into the microphone Derek had positioned near the piano. Her voice was stronger now, drawing on reserves of confidence she'd built over decades of musical experience. Derek rolled his eyes at the camera. "Chopin, how wonderfully predictable," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm sure this will be very educational for all of us." The audience was primed for disaster. They'd been conditioned by Derek's introduction to expect something laughable. Camera operators zoomed in on Margaret's wrinkled hands, ready to capture every mistake. The lighting technician had even adjusted the spots to be slightly too bright, hoping to make her look more frail and out of place. But Margaret Chung had spent 72 years preparing for this moment, even though she'd never known it was coming. As her fingers touched the keys for the first time, something magical was about to happen that would change everything. For her, for Derek, for every person in that studio, and eventually for millions of people around the world. Margaret's fingers made contact with the keys, and the first notes of Chopin's Minute Waltz began to fill the studio. But something went wrong immediately. 3 of the keys she needed for the opening phrase stuck completely, refusing to make any sound at all. The buzzing from inside the piano was louder than she'd expected, creating an ugly rattling that threatened to ruin the melody. For a split second, panic flashed across Margaret's face. The audience started to murmur, and she could hear a few people beginning to giggle. Derek's smile grew wider as he watched what he assumed would be a spectacular failure unfolding exactly as planned. But then something extraordinary happened. Instead of stopping, instead of making excuses or giving up, Margaret did something that stunned everyone in that studio. She adapted. Her 72 years of musical experience kicked in like a reflex. When the E-flat key refused to work, she instantly transposed that section to a different key. When the F above middle C stuck, she improvised a beautiful variation that avoided that note entirely. The broken piano that was meant to humiliate her became a challenge that her trained mind solved in real time. The buzzing sound from the damaged strings, instead of ruining her performance, became part of it. Margaret adjusted her playing style to work with the noise, creating moments of silence that made the unwanted sound seem intentional, like percussion in a modern composition. Within the first 30 seconds, the giggles from the audience began to fade. People started to lean forward in their seats, realizing that something unexpected was happening. This wasn't the disaster they'd been prepared to laugh at. This was something else entirely. Margaret's hands moved across the keys with a grace that defied her age. Despite the awkward bench height that forced her to strain her shoulders, despite the broken keys that should have made the piece impossible to play, she was creating music that was not just competent, it was beautiful. Derek's confident smirk started to waver. He glanced at his production team standing off to the side, and he could see confusion on their faces too. This wasn't going according to script. The old woman was supposed to struggle, to sound terrible, to give them material for jokes. Instead, she was playing around every obstacle they'd put in her way. As Margaret moved into the more complex middle section of the waltz, her fingers began to fly across the working keys. She'd mentally mapped out which keys to avoid and which ones would respond, and she was using that knowledge to create variations that were arguably more interesting than The original piece, the muscle memory of decades, came flooding back. This was the same piece she'd played for her mother when she was 12 years old. She'd performed it at her high school graduation. She'd taught it to countless students over the years. But she'd never played it quite like this, with such emotion. Such fire, such pure determination to overcome every obstacle. In the audience, a woman in the third row started to tear up. She was about Margaret's age, and something about watching this elderly woman refuse to be defeated was touching a deep place in her heart. The man sitting next to her stopped smiling and started really listening. A teenager in the back row pulled out her phone, not to mock, but to record something she sensed was special. Margaret's face had changed completely. The nervous, confused expression from earlier was gone, replaced by the focused intensity of a true musician lost in her art. Her eyes were closed now, and she was swaying slightly with the rhythm. Completely absorbed in the music flowing from her fingertips, Derek tried to maintain his composure, but inside he was starting to panic. This segment was supposed to be easy laughs, a quick bit of cruelty that would get the audience going for the rest of the show. Instead, he was watching his carefully planned humiliation fall apart note by note. The camera operators, who had been instructed to focus on Margaret's mistakes, found themselves capturing something entirely different. Her weathered hands moving, with surprising speed and dexterity. Her face, serene and concentrated, showing decades of musical wisdom. The way she instinctively leaned into the music despite the uncomfortable bench. One of the camera operators, a man named Carlos who had been working in television for 15 years, had never seen anything quite like this. He'd filmed hundreds of these cruel segments, watching ordinary people get torn apart for entertainment. But Margaret wasn't falling apart. She was rising above everything they'd done to sabotage her. The audio technician, who had been told to emphasize any mistakes in the mix, found himself doing the opposite. Without even thinking about it, he was adjusting the levels to make Margaret's playing sound as good as possible. The music was so compelling that he couldn't bring himself to make it sound worse. As Margaret transitioned into the final section of the piece, she made a decision that would define the rest of her performance. Instead of playing it safe with the limited keys available to her, she decided to take a risk. She began to improvise freely, using the waltz as a foundation for something entirely her own. Her left hand found a haunting bass line that worked around the broken lower keys. Her right hand danced through a melody that incorporated the original Chopin but expanded it into something more personal, more emotional. It was as if she was telling her life story through the music, the dreams she'd given up, the love she'd shared with Robert, the quiet strength that had carried her through decades of challenges. The audience was completely silent now. Even Derek had stopped moving, standing frozen at the side of the stage as he watched his planned disaster turn into something magical. Margaret's playing grew more confident with each passing moment. She was no longer the nervous, elderly woman who had walked onto the stage 5 minutes earlier. She was a musician, an artist, someone who had found her element despite every attempt to make her fail. The broken piano, meant to be her downfall, was becoming her triumph. Every stuck key she worked around, every buzzing string she incorporated into her performance, every obstacle she overcame was proof of her skill and experience. She was showing everyone in that studio what real talent looked like, not perfection, but the ability to create beauty under any circumstances. In homes across the country, people who had tuned in expecting to laugh at an old woman's embarrassment were instead witnessing something they would talk about for years to come. Social media was already starting to buzz, but not with the mockery Derek had expected. People were sharing the live stream with words like incredible and amazing, and this woman is a treasure. As Margaret built toward her final flourish, she opened her eyes and looked out at the audience for the first time since she'd started playing. What she saw surprised her. Instead of the laughing, mocking faces she'd expected, she saw people who were genuinely moved. Some were crying. Others were smiling with pure joy. A few were recording with their phones, but their expressions were filled with wonder, not ridicule. For the first time in years, Margaret Chun felt like the musician she had always been deep inside. The stage lights that had seemed so harsh when she walked out now felt warm and welcoming. The audience that had been primed to laugh at her was now completely under her spell as she prepared to bring her improvised masterpiece to a close. Margaret realized that this moment, this unexpected, terrifying, wonderful moment, was everything she had ever dreamed of during those quiet evenings playing alone in her apartment. Margaret's final notes hung in the air like magic dust, floating through the studio in a moment of perfect silence. For what felt like forever, nobody moved, nobody breathed. The entire room seemed frozen in time, as if everyone was afraid that making a sound might break the spell she had just cast. Then, slowly, one person started clapping. It was Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly woman in the third row who had been crying during the performance. Her applause was soft at first, almost hesitant, as if she wasn't sure if it was allowed. But as her hands came together, something amazing began to happen. The man sitting next to her joined in. Then the teenager behind them. Within seconds, the applause was spreading through the studio like wildfire, growing louder and more enthusiastic with each person who joined in. People weren't just clapping politely, they were celebrating something they had never expected to experience. Margaret sat at the piano bench, still slightly hunched forward from the awkward height, looking around in complete bewilderment. She had expected polite applause at best, maybe some encouraging smiles. She had never imagined anything like this. The sound of clapping filled the studio like thunder, and it just kept getting louder. Then something happened that Derek Mills had never seen in his 5 years of hosting Hidden Talents. People started standing up. First just a few in the front rows, then entire sections until the whole audience was on their feet, giving Margaret a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very walls of the studio. Derek stood frozen at the side of the stage, his mouth slightly open, his confident demeanor completely shattered. His expensive suit suddenly felt too tight, and his carefully styled hair felt ridiculous. He had built his career on making fun of people like Margaret, and now she had just shown him and everyone watching what real talent looked like. The applause continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, not tears of sadness or embarrassment, but tears of pure joy and relief. After decades of playing only for herself and her family, she was experiencing what she had given up when she chose to care for her parents. Instead of pursuing her musical dreams, behind the cameras, the production crew was having their own moment of reckoning. Jennifer, the production assistant who had felt guilty all morning, was wiping tears from her eyes. She had helped bring dozens of people to this stage to be humiliated, and she had hated herself a little more each time. But watching Margaret triumph over their cruelty was healing something broken inside her. Carlos, the camera operator, had abandoned his instructions completely. Instead of focusing on potentially embarrassing angles, his camera had captured every moment of Margaret's transformation from nervous elderly woman to confident artist. His footage would become some of the most powerful television ever recorded. Though he didn't know it yet, even Tony, Derek's head writer who had prepared all those cruel jokes, was applauding. The notebook with his mean-spirited comments had fallen to the floor forgotten. He was thinking about his own grandmother, who had passed away the year before, and wondering if he had ever really listened when she tried to share the things that mattered to her. As the applause finally began to fade, Margaret tried to stand up from the piano bench. Her legs felt shaky, partly from nerves, partly from the awkward position she'd been forced to play in, and partly from the overwhelming emotion of what had just happened. She took a small, careful step toward the center of the stage, still not quite believing what she was experiencing. Derek knew he had to say something. The show was still being broadcast live, and hundreds of thousands of people were watching. But every joke he had prepared, every cruel comment he had planned, felt impossible to say now. How could he mock someone who had just created something so beautiful? That was ... double quote Derek started, then stopped. His voice sounded strange, even to himself. That was truly remarkable, Margaret. The words came out more sincere than anything he had said on television in years. The audience, picking up on his genuine tone, applauded again. Margaret looked at him with surprise, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. With actual respect. I have to ask, Derek continued, his media training kicking in even as his usual confidence wavered. Where did you learn to play like that? That was incredible. Margaret's voice was soft when she answered, still shaky. From emotion, my mother taught me when I was very young. I studied classical piano for many years, but life took me in different directions. She paused, looking out at the audience with wonder. I never stopped loving music, though. I practice every day. Every day? Derek asked. And for the first time in his career, he was asking a question because he genuinely wanted to know the answer, not because he was setting up a punchline. Every morning, Margaret nodded. It keeps me connected to my family, to the people I've loved. When I play, I feel like they're still with me. A woman in the audience called out, "You're amazing." And others joined in with similar shouts of encouragement. Margaret looked overwhelmed by the positive response, her hand reaching up to touch her chest as if to calm her racing heart. Derek looked around the studio, seeing his crew and audience in a new light. For years, he had built his success on finding people's weaknesses and exploiting them for laughs. He had convinced himself that it was harmless entertainment, that people wanted to see others fail because it made them feel better about their own lives. But looking at Margaret now, seeing the joy on the faces of everyone in the studio, Derek realized he had been wrong about everything. Real entertainment didn't come from tearing people down. It came from lifting them up, from witnessing genuine human excellence and emotion. The studio audience was still buzzing with excitement, people talking to each other about what they had just witnessed. Many were pulling out their phones, not to mock or share embarrassing moments, but to tell friends and family about something amazing they had just experienced. In the control room, the show's director was making frantic phone calls. The network executives were already asking questions about the segment. Social media was exploding with clips of Margaret's performance. This wasn't going according to any plan they had ever made, but Margaret was oblivious to all of this behind the scenes. Drama. She was still processing what had just happened to her. For the first time in decades, she had shared her music with strangers and been met not with indifference or annoyance, but with genuine appreciation and love. Margaret, Derek said, his voice carrying none of his usual showman swagger, I speak for everyone here when I say that was one of the most beautiful performances we've ever had on this show. The audience erupted in agreement, and Margaret smiled, a real, radiant smile that transformed her entire face. She looked younger, more alive, more herself than she had in years. As the segment prepared to end. None of them knew that this moment would become a turning point, not just for Margaret, but for everyone who had witnessed it. The video would spread around the world, changing lives and touching hearts in ways that none of them could imagine. Margaret Chin had walked onto that stage as an elderly woman that people were prepared to mock. But she was leaving as something else entirely, a reminder that talent and dignity could triumph over any cruelty, and that real magic could happen when someone was brave enough to share their authentic self with the world. Within minutes of Margaret's performance ending, something extraordinary began happening in the digital world. The studio audience members who had recorded clips on their phones were already uploading them to social media. But these weren't the usual cruel posts that Derek's show typically generated. These videos came with captions like, "This woman is incredible, and I'm crying watching this beautiful performance." Ashley, a college student who had been in the studio audience, posted a short video clip to her social media account. Came here, expecting to laugh at an old lady playing piano, she wrote. Instead, I witnessed pure magic. This woman has more talent in her pinky finger than most people have in their entire body. I'm shaking from how beautiful this was. Her post was shared 50 times in the first hour, then 500 times. Within 3 hours, it had been shared over 10,000 times, and the numbers kept climbing, but Margaret knew nothing about any of this social media explosion. After the show ended, she sat in the green room, still trying to process what had happened. Jennifer brought her a cup of tea and sat down beside her, something she had never done with any other guest. Mrs. Chun, Jennifer said quietly, I need to apologize to you. We didn't bring you here with good intentions. We thought we were going to Well, we thought you would struggle, and we were planning to make fun of you. Margaret looked at her with kind eyes, not anger or hurt, but genuine curiosity. Why would you want to do that, dear? Jennifer felt her throat tighten. Because that's what this show does. We bring people on who we think will fail, and then we laugh at them. It's terrible, and I've hated myself for being part of it. But after watching you out there, she paused, wiping away a tear. You made us all remember what real talent looks like. Margaret reached over and patted Jennifer's hand gently. Everyone makes mistakes, sweetheart. What matters is what we do next. Meanwhile, Derek was in his dressing room having the worst professional crisis of his life. His phone was ringing constantly with calls from network executives, and his social media accounts were exploding with notifications. But these weren't the usual congratulatory messages he received after a show. People were angry. His assistant knocked on the door. "Derek, you need to see this," she said, holding up her tablet. "The video of Margaret's performance is everywhere, and people are not happy about how you introduced her." Derek looked at the screen and saw thousands of comments calling him cruel, heartless, and worse. People were sharing side-by-side videos showing his mocking introduction followed by Margaret's incredible performance. The contrast made him look even worse than he had imagined possible. "Look at this hashtag," his assistant continued, scrolling through the posts. People are using hashtag respect Margaret and hashtag shame on Derek. Some are calling for the show to be canceled. Derek sat down heavily in his chair. He had built his career on making people laugh at others' expense, but now he was the one being laughed at, except it wasn't funny. It was devastating. Back home in her apartment building, Karen was having her own reckoning. She had watched the show live, expecting to see Margaret embarrass herself on national television. Instead, she had witnessed something that made her feel sick to her stomach. Karen had spent 2 years complaining about Margaret's piano playing, calling it noise and demanding that it stop. But now she realized the truth. Margaret wasn't just good at piano, she was extraordinary. All those times Karen had banged on the wall and demanded quiet. She had been trying to silence genuine artistry. The worst part was knowing that this was all her fault. She had nominated Margaret for the show specifically to humiliate her. She had laughed on the phone with the producers about the crazy old lady next door. Now the whole world could see what Margaret was really capable of. And Karen looked like a jealous, petty person who had tried to destroy something beautiful. Karen's own phone was starting to ring. Somehow, people had figured out that she was the neighbor who had nominated Margaret. Local news stations wanted to interview her. Social media users were finding her accounts and leaving angry messages. She had become part of the story, but not in the way she had planned. Meanwhile, Margaret's performance was spreading far beyond social media. News websites were picking up the story. Television networks were showing clips during their evening broadcasts. Radio stations were talking about the elderly woman who had stunned everyone with her incredible piano skills. Dr. Patricia Williams, a music professor at the local university, saw the video and immediately recognized something special. She had trained hundreds of pianists over her career, and she could tell that Margaret wasn't just talented, she was professionally trained. The way she adapted to the broken piano, the sophistication of her improvisations, the emotional depth of her performance, these weren't the skills of a casual amateur. Dr. Williams made some phone calls to colleagues, trying to find out more about Margaret's background. What she discovered amazed her even more. Through old university records and music competition archives, she found that Margaret Liu had been a rising star in the classical music world 50 years ago. She had won several prestigious competitions and had been accepted to study at one of the most elite music conservatories in the country. This woman gave up what could have been an incredible career, Dr. Williams told a reporter who called her for comment. What we witnessed today wasn't just a good performance by an elderly amateur. This was a master musician showing us what decades of skill and experience look like. The story was becoming bigger than anyone had imagined. People weren't just sharing the video because it was heartwarming. They were sharing it because it challenged everything they thought they knew about talent, age, and the value of elderly people in society, Margaret's phone started ringing in her apartment. The first call was from her daughter Linda, who was crying and laughing at the same time. "Mom, I just saw the video," Linda said. "I had no idea. I mean, I knew you were good, but this... Mom, you're incredible. The whole internet is talking about you." "The internet?" Margaret asked, confused. "I don't understand what that means." Linda tried to explain how the video was spreading around the world, how millions of people were watching her performance and celebrating her talent. Margaret listened with growing amazement, not quite able to grasp the scale of what was happening. More calls came in: a reporter from the local newspaper, a producer from a morning show, someone from a record label. Margaret felt overwhelmed by all the attention, but also touched by how many people seemed to care about her music. That evening, Margaret sat at her old piano, the same one she had played that morning before leaving for the television studio. It felt different now somehow, not because anything had changed about the instrument, but because she felt different about herself. For years, she had thought of her piano playing as just a personal hobby, something that helped her feel connected to her family and her past. She had never imagined that her music could touch other people the way it apparently had that day. As she played a gentle melody in the quiet of her apartment, Margaret realized that sometimes the most unexpected moments can change everything. She had gone to that television studio thinking she might share her music with a small audience for a few minutes. Instead, she had reminded the world that talent, dignity, and the human spirit could triumph over any attempt to diminish them. 3 months after that life-changing day in the television studio, Margaret Chin's world had transformed in ways she never could have imagined. The video of her performance had been watched by over 50 million people around the globe, making her an overnight sensation at the age of 78, but Margaret had handled her sudden fame with the same grace and dignity she had shown that day on stage. When concert halls began calling with offers, she carefully chose only a few special performances. Her first official concert was at the city's historic Symphony Hall, where she played for an audience of 2,000 people who gave her 3 standing ovations. The most meaningful invitation came from Dr. Patricia Williams at the university. She asked Margaret to give a master class to the advanced piano students, sharing not just her technique but her life story. Margaret agreed, and the session became one of the most powerful teaching moments the music department had ever experienced. "Music isn't just about hitting the right notes," Margaret told the young students as she sat at the beautiful grand piano in the university's recital hall. "It's about putting your whole life into every piece you play. Your joy, your sadness, your love, your losses, all of it becomes part of the music." One of the students, a talented 19-year-old named Kevin, raised his hand. "Mrs. Chun, do you ever regret giving up your career when you were young?" Margaret thought carefully before answering. "I made the choice that felt right for my family at the time. I don't regret loving and caring for the people who mattered to me. But I do regret thinking that my music wasn't important enough to share with the world. I spent too many years believing that what I could do didn't matter." The room was silent as the students absorbed her words. Many of them were struggling with their own doubts about pursuing music professionally, and Margaret's story gave them a new perspective on what success really meant. Meanwhile, Derek Mills was learning some harsh lessons about the consequences of building a career on cruelty. Hidden Talents had been canceled just 6 weeks after Margaret's appearance. The network received so many complaints about the show's treatment of guests that advertisers started pulling their support. Derek found himself unemployed and largely unemployable in television. No network wanted to hire someone who had become synonymous with bullying elderly people. He spent long days in his expensive apartment, watching his savings dwindle and his career prospects disappear. But Derek's story didn't end in complete ruin. 3 months after losing his job, he did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He showed up at Margaret's apartment building with a handwritten letter and asked if he could speak with her. Margaret invited him in, offering tea and cookies as if he were any other visitor. Derek sat uncomfortably on her small couch, surrounded by family photos and the piano that had started it all. Mrs. Chun, he began, his voice shaky, I need to apologize to you. What I did was wrong. I brought you on my show planning to humiliate you, and I'm deeply ashamed of that. Margaret listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. I've spent my whole career making fun of people, Derek continued. I convinced myself it was just entertainment, but watching what happened to you made me realize how cruel I've been. You deserved respect from the moment you walked onto that stage, and I failed to give it to you. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, then she said, Derek, we all make mistakes. What matters is what we do to make things right. I don't know how to make this right, Derek admitted. My career is over, which is probably what I deserve. But I wanted you to know that watching your performance changed something in me. You reminded me that there are good people in the world doing beautiful things, and I spent years trying to tear them down. Margaret surprised him by reaching over and patting his hand, the same gesture she had made with Jennifer that day at the studio. People can change, dear. It's never too late to choose kindness. Derek left that day with tears in his eyes and a determination to rebuild his life around better values. He eventually found work with a nonprofit organization that provided music education to underprivileged children. Using his media skills to help rather than hurt, Karen's journey was more difficult. The shame of knowing she had tried to humiliate Margaret ate away at her for weeks. She lost sleep, couldn't concentrate at work, and found herself crying at random moments throughout the day. Finally, she worked up the courage to knock on Margaret's door. When Margaret opened it, Karen broke down completely. I'm so sorry, she sobbed. I tried to hurt you because I was jealous. Your music is beautiful, and I was too bitter to admit it. I nominated you for that show hoping they would make fun of you, and I hate myself for it. Margaret held the younger woman while she cried, offering the same forgiveness she had given to Derek. Karen, dear, we all have darkness in our hearts sometimes, but we also have the ability to choose light. From that day forward, Karen became one of Margaret's biggest supporters. She helped organize Margaret's home concerts and even learned to play piano herself, taking lessons from a teacher Margaret recommended. The story took on a life of its own beyond just the people directly involved. Margaret's performance became a symbol of hope for elderly people around the world who felt invisible or dismissed by society. Nursing homes started organizing talent shows. Adult education centers saw increases in enrollment for music classes. Families began paying more attention to the stories and skills of their elderly relatives. Margaret used her newfound platform to establish something she called the Second Chances Music Foundation. The organization provided piano lessons and instruments to elderly people who wanted to pursue music later in life. She also created scholarships for young musicians whose families couldn't afford lessons. Remembering her own early struggles, the foundation's first major event was a concert featuring both elderly amateur musicians and young professional performers. Margaret played alongside a 90-year-old man who had always wanted to learn violin and a 16-year-old prodigy who had grown up in poverty but found music through a community program. Music has no expiration date, Margaret told the audience that night. It doesn't matter if you're 8 or 80, if you have something beautiful to share with the world needs to hear it. 1 year after her television appearance, Margaret received a letter that made her cry happy tears. It was from a 75-year-old woman in another state who had watched the video and been inspired to audition for her local community orchestra. She had been accepted and was now playing violin in concerts for the first time in her life. You showed me that it's never too late to be brave, the woman wrote. Thank you for reminding all of us that our dreams don't have to die just because we get older. Margaret kept that letter in her piano bench, along with hundreds of others from people around the world who had been touched by her story. On quiet evenings, she would read through them and marvel at how one moment of unexpected courage had created ripples that reached so far. As she sat at her old piano each morning, playing the same pieces she had always loved, Margaret felt a deep sense of contentment. She had learned that sharing your gifts with the world, no matter how scary it might seem, was always worth the risk. Her music had always been beautiful, but now it was also powerful, a reminder that dignity, talent, and the human spirit could overcome any attempt to diminish them. And every time she played, Margaret remembered that day in the television studio when everything changed. Not because she became someone different, but because she finally allowed the world to see who she had always been.